Imagine standing at the gates of a house so massive that it contains more rooms than most people will visit in their entire lifetime. 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, a building so enormous that if you walked through every hallway and corridor, you'd cover nearly 4 miles. Why would one person need all of this? What drives a human being to create something so extraordinarily excessive? The answer lies in the extraordinary story of George Washington Vanderbilt II and his American castle in the mountains of North Carolina. The birth of an impossible dream. The year was 1888, and America was in the midst of what historians would later call the Gilded Age. This was an era when industrial titans amassed fortunes so vast they made modern billionaires look modest by comparison. The nation's wealth was concentrating in the hands of a few families, and none were more prominent than the Vanderbilts. They had built their empire on railroads, connecting a growing nation with steel tracks and steam engines. The family name was synonymous with wealth, power, and prestige. George Vanderbilt was different from his brothers and cousins. While they focused on expanding the family's business interests and building ostentatious mansions in New York City and Newport, George was a quiet, bookish man with a profound love for art, architecture, and nature. He had inherited millions from his father, but unlike many of his contemporaries who flaunted their wealth through endless parties and social climbing, George dreamed of creating something meaningful, something that would last for generations. During a visit to Asheville, North Carolina, in the winter of 1888, George fell in love with the Blue Ridge Mountains. The landscape spoke to something deep within him. The rolling hills, the crisp mountain air, the way morning mist clung to the valleys like delicate lace. He saw potential where others saw only wilderness. He envisioned an estate that would rival the great European country houses he had admired during his extensive travels abroad. But this wouldn't be merely a copy of European grandeur. This would be something uniquely American, a testament to what the New World could achieve. George began purchasing land, not just a few acres for a modest country home, but thousands upon thousands of acres. His vision expanded with each passing month. By the time he was finished, he had assembled a staggering 125,000 acres of mountain wilderness. To put this in perspective, that's approximately 195 square miles, an area larger than many American cities. This wasn't going to be just an estate. It was going to be a self-sufficient world unto itself. Assembling the dream team, George Vanderbilt understood that to create something truly extraordinary, he needed the best minds of his generation. He didn't want competent architects and landscapers. He wanted visionaries, artists who could transform his dream into reality. And so began one of the most remarkable collaborations in American architectural history. For the mansion itself, George turned to Richard Morris Hunt, arguably the most prestigious architect in America at the time. Hunt had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so, and he had designed mansions for several Vanderbilt family members. But Biltmore would be his masterpiece, his magnum opus. Hunt embraced the challenge with enthusiasm. He proposed a French Renaissance chateau style, inspired by the magnificent Loire Valley castles of France, but adapted for the American landscape and sensibility. The collaboration between George and Hunt was extraordinary. George wasn't merely a wealthy client writing checks and waiting for results. He was deeply involved in every aspect of the design, bringing his extensive knowledge of European architecture to the table. The two men would spend hours discussing proportions, materials, and design elements, creating what would become America's largest private residence. For the grounds, George hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the genius behind New York's Central Park and countless other celebrated landscapes across America. Olmsted was already in his 60s and at the peak of his career when he took on the Biltmore project. Initially, he was skeptical. The land George had purchased was in poor condition, much of it overlogged and eroded. Previous owners had stripped the forests for timber without thought for sustainability. But Olmsted saw an opportunity not just to create a beautiful landscape, but to demonstrate scientific forestry and land management on an unprecedented scale. Olmsted's vision for Biltmore was revolutionary. He didn't simply want to plant pretty gardens around a mansion. He wanted to rehabilitate thousands of acres of damaged land, create sustainable forests, develop productive farms, and design landscapes that would enhance the natural beauty of the mountains rather than competing with them. It was an early example of environmental conservation on a massive scale, decades before such thinking became mainstream. To manage what would become America's first scientifically managed forest, George brought in Gifford Pinchot, a young forester who had studied in Europe. Pinchot would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service and a pivotal figure in American conservation. At Biltmore, he implemented revolutionary forestry practices, proving that forests could be managed sustainably while still producing timber and generating income. This work would influence American environmental policy for generations to come. The Construction Marathon. On a crisp autumn day in 1889, construction began. What followed was a 6-year odyssey of building on a scale America had rarely seen. This wasn't like constructing modern buildings with prefabricated materials and power tools. Everything had to be done with the technology and methods of the 1890s, requiring incredible ingenuity, manpower, and patience. A private railroad spur was constructed specifically to bring materials to the construction site. Trainloads of limestone from Indiana, marble from Italy, oak and walnut from the property's own forests, and countless other materials arrived in an endless stream. At the peak of construction, over 1,000 workers labored on the estate. These weren't just construction workers. They were artisans, craftsmen, and specialists brought in from around the world. Stone carvers from Italy, woodworkers from Germany, landscape gardeners from England, and skilled laborers from across America converged on this remote mountain location. The logistics were staggering. This was rural North Carolina in the 1890s, far from major industrial centers. Every nail, every brick, every piece of glass had to be transported over rough mountain roads or by rail. A small village sprang up to house the workers and their families. Temporary workshops, dormitories, and facilities had to be constructed before work on the mansion could even begin in earnest. The estate essentially created its own economy, its own infrastructure, its own world. The foundation alone took months to complete. The mansion would sit on a stone basement so vast it could hold multiple modern houses. The walls rose slowly, massive blocks of limestone carefully fitted together. Unlike many Gilded Age mansions that used cheaper materials with a thin veneer of stone, Biltmore was built to last centuries. The walls were solid limestone, in some places several feet thick. This was a castle in every sense of the word, built with the same permanence as medieval fortresses. As the exterior walls climbed skyward, work began simultaneously on the interior. The house would contain not just bedrooms and living spaces, but also a complete infrastructure that was revolutionary for its time. Miles of electrical wiring were installed. Biltmore would be one of the first private residences in North Carolina to have electric lighting throughout. A sophisticated heating system using steam heat was designed to keep the massive structure warm during harsh mountain winters. Indoor plumbing, still a luxury in the 1890s, was installed throughout, with bathrooms featuring the latest fixtures imported from Europe. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Ceilings were hand-painted or covered with elaborate plasterwork. Walls were paneled in rare woods, each piece carefully selected and fitted. Massive fireplaces, some large enough to stand inside, were constructed from stone and marble. The flooring alone was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, with different rooms featuring parquet patterns in oak, walnut, and other precious woods. George Vanderbilt personally oversaw the installation of his vast library, which would eventually house over 22,000 volumes. Special rooms were designed to display his art collection, which included paintings by Renoir, Sargent, and other masters. Every room had a purpose, every space was thoughtfully designed. This wasn't ostentatious display for its own sake. George wanted to create a home that reflected his refined tastes and intellectual pursuits, a place where art, nature, and comfortable living could coexist. The magnificent structure takes shape. When Biltmore House was finally completed in 1895, it stood as an architectural marvel unlike anything America had seen. The building stretched 780 feet across its front, with multiple wings, towers, and architectural features that made it look like it had been transplanted from the French countryside. The numbers alone are staggering. The house encompasses 178,926 square feet of floor space, approximately 4 acres under one roof. There are 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. The basement alone contains a swimming pool, bowling alley, and gymnasium, luxuries that were almost unheard of in private homes of the era. The house contains 3 kitchens, multiple dining rooms, a vast banquet hall, a library that rivals many university collections, and countless other rooms for every conceivable purpose. But statistics don't capture the sheer magnificence of the place. Walking through the front entrance, visitors are greeted by an entrance hall with a soaring 70-foot ceiling. The space is so vast that entire houses could fit inside it. A grand staircase of carved oak rises in elegant curves, lit by enormous wrought-iron chandeliers. The craftsmanship is breathtaking. Every newel post, every baluster, every piece of decorative carving was created by master craftsmen at the peak of their skills. The banquet hall is perhaps the most impressive room. Measuring 72 feet long with a 70-foot ceiling, it features a triple fireplace large enough to accommodate logs 8 feet long. The walls are covered with tapestries and paintings, including a portrait of George Vanderbilt himself. Above, exposed wooden beams curve across the ceiling in an architectural feat that still impresses modern engineers. This was a room designed to host grand dinner parties for dozens of guests, yet the acoustics were carefully planned so that conversations could be held without shouting. The library contains over 10,000 volumes just in this one room, with thousands more elsewhere in the house. The ceiling is painted with a stunning work of art by Italian artist Giovanni Antonio Pellegrini, depicting Aurora riding through the clouds. The room features a beautiful fireplace, comfortable seating areas, and walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. For George, this wasn't a showpiece. This was his sanctuary, where he spent countless hours reading, studying, and contemplating. The Winter Garden is an enclosed courtyard with a glass ceiling where tropical plants grow year-round despite the mountain climate outside. A central fountain provides soothing sounds of water, and carefully arranged plants create a paradise within the house. This was a revolutionary concept for the time, bringing the outdoors inside in a controlled, beautiful environment. The hidden world below. While the magnificent rooms of Biltmore's main floors attracted admiration and awe, the real genius of the house lay in what couldn't be seen by guests. George Vanderbilt and his architects understood that for a house of this scale to function smoothly, it needed an elaborate support system hidden from view. What they created was nothing short of revolutionary for its time. Beneath the grandeur of the main floors lay a world that few visitors would ever see, a world that made the magic of Biltmore possible. The basement level of the mansion is a labyrinth of passages, rooms, and facilities that functioned like the engine room of a great ship. Here, an army of servants worked to maintain the comfort and lifestyle of the Vanderbilts and their guests without ever being seen or heard. The servants' corridors formed a separate circulation system throughout the house. Narrow passages, hidden staircases, and concealed doors allowed staff to move throughout the mansion invisibly. A servant could travel from the kitchens to any bedroom, from the laundry to the dining room, all without ever crossing paths with family or guests. This wasn't cruelty. This was the standard operation of any great house of the era, where the machinery of comfort was meant to operate silently and invisibly. The kitchen complex was enormous and incredibly sophisticated for its time. Multiple rooms handled different aspects of food preparation. There was a rotisserie kitchen with a massive open hearth for roasting meats. A separate pastry kitchen with marble countertops provided cool surfaces for delicate baking. A main preparation kitchen contained the latest cooking technology of the 1890s, including early versions of commercial ranges and ovens. Storage rooms kept dry goods. A separate ice room maintained cold storage before electric refrigeration became common, and wine cellars held thousands of bottles in temperature-controlled conditions. The laundry facilities were equally impressive. Multiple rooms handled washing, drying, ironing, and folding linens and clothing for the household. With dozens of bedrooms, multiple dining areas, and the need for frequent changes of clothing according to the social customs of the time, the laundry operations were a massive undertaking. Special equipment was installed for washing delicate items, and separate areas handled different types of fabrics and garments. Perhaps most impressive was the mechanical infrastructure hidden throughout the basement. Boilers that powered the heating system were enormous, capable of producing enough steam to heat the vast spaces above. Electric generators provided power for lighting and the few electric appliances of the era. A sophisticated refrigeration system, using ice and advanced insulation techniques, kept food fresh. Pumps brought water from the estate's springs, distributed it throughout the house, and handled waste removal. There are persistent stories, some verified and others that have taken on legendary status, of secret passages and hidden rooms throughout Biltmore. While the house does contain numerous concealed doors and passages, most of these served practical purposes rather than mysterious ones. Servants needed to move invisibly, and mechanical systems required access points. However, the sheer complexity of the house's layout means that even today there are spaces and passages that are rarely visited or fully understood. One particularly intriguing feature is the swimming pool in the basement, one of the first indoor pools in an American home. But this wasn't just a pool. The room housing it was designed like an ancient Roman bath, with elegant tile work, underwater lighting that was revolutionary for its time, and sophisticated water circulation systems. Adjacent to the pool were changing rooms, a lounge area, and even an early version of a sauna. The bowling alley, also in the basement, was another innovation. Complete with pin-setting mechanisms and a spectator area, it provided entertainment without the need to leave the estate. Nearby, a gymnasium contained exercise equipment that was state-of-the-art for the 1890s, showing George's commitment to health and physical fitness. Life among the aristocracy. When George Vanderbilt finally took up residence in his completed mansion, he didn't do so alone. On June 1, 1898, he married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, a woman of intelligence, beauty, and refined taste who was perfectly suited to be the mistress of such an estate. Edith wasn't merely decorative arm candy for a wealthy man. She was educated, cultured, and possessed considerable social skills that George, for all his refinement, somewhat lacked. She transformed Biltmore from a magnificent house into a true home. The daily life at Biltmore during George and Edith's time was a fascinating blend of European aristocratic tradition and American innovation. The day began early for the staff, who had to prepare the house before the family awakened. Fireplaces needed to be cleaned and relaid, breakfast had to be prepared, and the house needed to be spotless before family and any guests began their day. For George and Edith, the day typically began with breakfast in their private quarters or in one of the smaller dining rooms. The formality of meals varied depending on whether they were alone or entertaining guests. When alone, they might enjoy a relatively simple breakfast, though simple is relative when you have a staff of dozens preparing your food. When guests were present, breakfast became an elaborate affair with multiple courses served on fine china. George spent much of his time managing the estate, though he had capable managers to handle day-to-day operations. He was deeply involved in the forestry operations, the agricultural experiments, and the development of what would become Biltmore Village, a model community for estate workers. He maintained extensive correspondence with scientists, artists, and intellectuals across America and Europe. His library wasn't just for show. He was a voracious reader who continued his education throughout his life. Edith took charge of the social aspects of the estate and involved herself deeply in the local community. Unlike many of the wealthy women of her era who saw charity work as merely a social obligation, Edith was genuinely committed to improving the lives of people in the Asheville area. She established schools, supported medical facilities, and helped develop programs for the children of estate workers. When the Vanderbilts entertained, which they did frequently, Biltmore came alive with activity. House parties could last for days or even weeks, with guests arriving by private rail car and settling into beautifully appointed bedrooms. The social calendar during these gatherings was elaborate. Mornings might be spent horseback riding through the estate's miles of trails, or perhaps hunting in the forests. Afternoons could include lawn tennis, archery, or simply enjoying the gardens. Some guests might prefer a swim in the indoor pool or a game of bowling. Evenings were formal affairs. Guests were expected to dress for dinner, which for men meant formal evening wear, and for women meant elaborate gowns that took hours to prepare with the help of ladies' maids. Dinner itself was an event that could last several hours, with multiple courses, fine wines from the extensive cellars, and witty conversation. After dinner, the party might retire to the music room for entertainment, to the library for intellectual discussion, or to the billiard room for games. The staff required to maintain this lifestyle was enormous. At its peak, Biltmore employed hundreds of people just to run the house and immediate grounds. There were teams of housemaids who cleaned the vast spaces, laundered the endless quantities of linens, and maintained the rooms. Kitchen staff prepared multiple meals daily for family, guests, and senior staff. Footmen served at table, maintained the dining rooms, and attended to guests' needs. Butlers supervised the household staff and ensured everything ran smoothly. Outside the main house, even more workers were employed. Gardeners maintained the elaborate landscapes, stables housed horses and employed grooms and farriers. The farm operations required field workers and animal handlers, and the forestry operations employed hundreds more. There were craftsmen of every description, mechanics to maintain the increasing number of vehicles and machines, and administrators to manage the complex operations of what was essentially a self-sufficient community. But life at Biltmore wasn't all aristocratic leisure. George Vanderbilt took his responsibilities seriously. He saw the estate not just as a private pleasure ground, but as a place where important work could be done. The forestry operations were demonstrating sustainable land management. The farms were experimenting with new techniques and crops. The dairy produced high-quality products while maintaining model conditions for the animals. Biltmore was, in many ways, ahead of its time in its approach to land stewardship and social responsibility. The hidden village. What many people don't realize when they visit Biltmore today is that the estate wasn't just the mansion and its immediate grounds. George Vanderbilt created an entire ecosystem to support his estate, and at the heart of this ecosystem was what became known as Biltmore Village, a planned community that was revolutionary for its time. George worked with architect Richard Sharp Smith, who had been the supervising architect on the mansion, to design a model village for estate workers and the growing number of people who were moving to Asheville because of Biltmore. This wasn't a collection of shabby workers' cottages thrown up as an afterthought. This was a carefully planned community with well-built homes, proper sanitation, electricity, and all the amenities of modern life. The village included a variety of housing options, from smaller cottages for individual workers to larger homes for families and senior staff. Each home was built to high standards with solid construction, proper heating, and indoor plumbing, luxuries that were far from standard in rural America at the time. The architectural style was English countryside cottage, giving the village a charming, cohesive appearance. But housing was just the beginning. George understood that a community needed more than just places to live. The village included a church, All Souls Episcopal Cathedral, which still stands today as one of the finest examples of church architecture in the region. A hospital provided medical care not just for estate workers, but for the broader Asheville community. Schools educated workers' children, with Edith Vanderbilt particularly involved in ensuring quality education was available. The village also had shops, workshops, and offices that served both the estate and the growing town of Asheville. There was a train station, as the railroad spur that had brought materials for the mansion's construction continued to serve the community. In many ways, Biltmore Village was like a small English estate town, transplanted to the mountains of North Carolina and updated with American innovations. Life in the village was closely tied to the estate. Many residents worked directly for Biltmore in various capacities. The skilled craftsmen who had built the house often stayed on, finding employment maintaining the property or working in the various enterprises George developed. The village had its own social structure, its own rhythm of life, all revolving around the great house on the hill. Working for the Vanderbilts was considered desirable employment. George and Edith were known as fair and generous employers who took an interest in their workers' welfare. The pay was good by the standards of the time, housing was provided or subsidized, and there were opportunities for advancement. The estate provided medical care, education for workers' children, and even organized social events and recreation. However, it would be naive to romanticize these arrangements completely. This was still the Gilded Age, a time of vast disparities between rich and poor. The Vanderbilts lived in unimaginable luxury, while their workers, though better off than many, still led lives of hard labor and relative modesty. The social hierarchy was rigid, and crossing class boundaries was virtually impossible. Yet within the context of their time, the Vanderbilts were considered progressive and humane employers. The village and the larger estate functioned as a kind of feudal system updated for the industrial age. The Vanderbilts were the lords of this domain, but they took seriously the obligations that came with that position. They provided employment, housing, medical care, and education. In return, they received service and loyalty. It was a system that seems strange to modern sensibilities, but made perfect sense in the context of the 1890s and early 1900s. The agricultural empire. Beyond the mansion, beyond the village, stretched thousands of acres that George Vanderbilt transformed into a model of agricultural excellence. This wasn't gentleman farming where a wealthy landowner dabbled in agriculture as a hobby. This was serious, scientific agriculture aimed at demonstrating what could be achieved with modern methods, proper resources, and expert management. The dairy operation at Biltmore became particularly famous. George imported prize Jersey cattle from the island of Jersey, building a herd that produced milk and butter of exceptional quality. The dairy barns were architectural marvels in their own right, designed with the latest understanding of hygiene and animal welfare. The cows lived in clean, well-ventilated conditions that were better than the housing available to many humans at the time. The milk and cream from the Biltmore dairy were renowned for their richness and purity. The butter won prizes at agricultural fairs across the country. This wasn't just about providing for the mansion's needs, though it certainly did that. George was demonstrating that American agriculture could equal or exceed European standards. He was also creating a profitable business that helped support the enormous costs of maintaining the estate. The estate's farms produced a diverse array of crops. Vegetables and fruits fed the household and were sold to markets in Asheville. Experimental plots tested new varieties and growing methods. Orchards produced apples, pears, and other fruits. Livestock operations included not just dairy cattle, but also pigs, chickens, and other animals. The estate was largely self-sufficient in food production, an impressive achievement given the number of people it had to feed. The forestry operations, under Gifford Pinchot's management and later under Carl Schenck, who founded the first forestry school in America on the estate, transformed thousands of acres of damaged woodland. They demonstrated that forests could be logged sustainably, providing timber and income while maintaining and even improving the health of the ecosystem. Trees were selectively harvested, replanting was done systematically, and scientific methods replaced the destructive clear-cutting that had previously dominated American forestry. These operations weren't hidden away. George welcomed visitors who wanted to learn about scientific agriculture and forestry. The estate became a destination for students, other landowners, and agricultural experts who wanted to see these innovative methods in action. In this way, Biltmore's influence extended far beyond its own boundaries, helping to shape American approaches to land management that continue to this day. The changing times. The early 1900s brought changes to Biltmore and to America. George Vanderbilt's health began to decline, and in 1914, at the tragically young age of 51, he died unexpectedly following an appendectomy. His death was a shock to everyone who knew him and marked the end of an era for the estate. Edith Vanderbilt found herself in a difficult position. She was now responsible for an enormous estate with staggering operating costs and a young daughter, Cornelia, to raise. The income from the estate's operations, while substantial, wasn't sufficient to maintain the mansion and grounds at the level George had established. The federal income tax, instituted in 1913, added new financial pressures that the Vanderbilts and other wealthy families had never faced before. Edith proved to be a capable manager. She made difficult decisions about which operations to continue and which to scale back. She sold off some of the land, including a large tract that would eventually become Pisgah National Forest, ensuring that George's conservation work would be preserved even as the estate shrank. She maintained the core of the property and kept the mansion as a family home. During World War I, Edith opened Biltmore to wounded soldiers, turning parts of the mansion into a convalescent hospital. This generous gesture was typical of her character and helped establish a tradition of Biltmore serving the broader community during times of crisis. Cornelia Vanderbilt grew up at Biltmore, experiencing a childhood that was simultaneously privileged and somewhat isolated. The estate was her playground, but the weight of being a Vanderbilt heir was always present. In 1924, she married John Francis Amherst Cecil, an English aristocrat, in what was considered the social event of the decade in North Carolina. The wedding at All Souls Cathedral drew crowds estimated in the thousands, all wanting a glimpse of America's closest thing to royalty. Cornelia and John had two sons, George and William Cecil, and for a time it seemed that Biltmore would continue as a private family estate indefinitely. But the Great Depression of the 1929 brought new financial challenges. The costs of maintaining such an enormous property during an economic catastrophe were staggering. The family had to make choices about the estate's future. The solution, ultimately, was to open Biltmore to the public. In 1930, the house and gardens began receiving paying visitors. This was a significant shift. The most private of private homes was becoming a public attraction. But it was necessary for survival, and it ensured that this architectural and historical treasure would be preserved for future generations. Preservation and modern times. Opening Biltmore to the public was just the beginning of its transformation. The Cecil family, descendants of Cornelia and John, took on the challenge of not just maintaining the estate, but making it financially sustainable. This required business acumen, creativity, and a delicate balance between preservation and innovation. William A. V. Cecil, George Vanderbilt's grandson, was particularly instrumental in developing Biltmore as a modern attraction while maintaining its historical integrity. Under his leadership, the estate expanded its offerings. The winery, established in 1985, became one of the most visited wineries in America. Hotels on the property allowed visitors to stay on the estate. Restaurants, shops, and outdoor activities diversified the revenue streams. Throughout all these changes, the family maintained a commitment to preservation. The mansion has been meticulously maintained, with ongoing restoration work, ensuring that future generations will be able to experience it much as George Vanderbilt's guests did. The furnishings, art, and decorative elements have been preserved or carefully conserved. The gardens, still magnificent, continue to follow Olmsted's original plans while adapting to modern horticultural understanding. Today, Biltmore attracts over 1 million visitors annually, making it one of the most popular private attractions in America. Visitors come from around the world to experience this slice of Gilded Age magnificence. Walking through the rooms, it's possible to imagine the house parties, the elaborate dinners, the quiet moments in the library. The estate has been featured in numerous films and television shows, further cementing its place in American cultural consciousness. But Biltmore is more than just a museum. It remains a working estate. The agricultural operations continue, now with modern methods, but still following the principle of sustainable land management that George Vanderbilt championed. The forests are still managed scientifically. The estate still employs hundreds of people, making it a significant economic force in the Asheville area. The COVID-19 pandemic brought new challenges, forcing temporary closures and requiring adaptations to keep staff and visitors safe. But Biltmore survived, as it has survived wars, depressions, and countless other challenges over its nearly 130-year history. The estate's resilience is a testament to the solidity of its original construction and the dedication of those who have worked to preserve it. The legacy. What is the legacy of Biltmore Estate? On one level, it's simply an impressive building, a monument to one family's wealth and one man's vision. The numbers are still staggering. The 250 rooms, the 135,000 square feet, the thousands of acres, the art collection, the library. All of it speaks to a level of wealth and ambition that seems almost incomprehensible today. But Biltmore's significance goes deeper than mere statistics. It represents a pivotal moment in American history. The Gilded Age was when America was transforming from a primarily agricultural nation into an industrial powerhouse. The wealth created during this era was unprecedented, and figures like the Vanderbilts embodied both the promise and the problems of this new industrial economy. George Vanderbilt's approach to his wealth was notable for his era. While he certainly lived luxuriously, he also used his resources to advance knowledge and demonstrate progressive ideas. The scientific forestry practiced at Biltmore influenced American conservation policy. The model village and fair treatment of workers, while not perfect by modern standards, were advanced for their time. The agricultural experiments contributed to American farming knowledge. Biltmore also represents the complex relationship between European culture and American identity. George Vanderbilt explicitly modeled his estate on European precedents, particularly the great French chateau. Yet in executing his vision, he created something distinctly American. The scale was American. The setting in the wild mountains was American. The democratic impulse to eventually open it to the public was American. For architecture and design enthusiasts, Biltmore is a masterclass in Gilded Age aesthetics and construction techniques. The building showcases the finest craftsmanship of its era. The design principles, the attention to detail, the integration of the building with its landscape, all of these continue to influence architects and designers today. Students of architecture make pilgrimages to Biltmore to study how Hunt combined various influences into a coherent whole, how he managed scale without losing intimacy, how he created a building that is simultaneously imposing and welcoming. The estate also serves as a reminder of the lives lived by working people during the Gilded Age. The hidden corridors, the servants' quarters, the elaborate systems that kept the household running. All of these tell stories of the hundreds of people whose labor made the lifestyle of the wealthy possible. It's a more complete picture of the era than we get from looking only at the grand rooms where the wealthy entertained. From a preservation standpoint, Biltmore is a success story. Many of the great estates of the Gilded Age have been demolished, subdivided, or lost to neglect. The fact that Biltmore survives intact, still owned by the Vanderbilt descendants, still operating as a cohesive whole, is remarkable. It required vision, dedication, and yes, continued wealth to accomplish this. But the result is that Americans and visitors from around the world can experience this piece of history directly rather than just reading about it in books. Conclusion: a monument to human ambition. So why did one man build a 250-room house? The simple answer is because he could. George Vanderbilt had the wealth, the vision, and the determination to create something extraordinary. But the more complete answer is more complex and more interesting. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore because he believed in the power of beauty, knowledge, and thoughtful stewardship. He wanted to create a place where art and nature could coexist, where modern scientific methods could be demonstrated, where a family could live graciously while contributing positively to their community. He succeeded beyond what even he might have imagined. Biltmore stands today, as it has for over a century, a monument to American ambition, wealth, and creativity. It reminds us of an era when individuals could undertake projects of almost unimaginable scale, when craftsmanship was valued above speed, when building something meant to last centuries was a reasonable goal. It also reminds us of the vast inequalities of that era, the rigid social hierarchies, and the countless workers whose names we don't know, but whose labor made it all possible. Walking through those 250 rooms today, it's easy to be overwhelmed by the sheer scale and magnificence, but perhaps the most remarkable thing about Biltmore isn't its size or luxury. It's that it still exists at all. In an age when so much is disposable, when buildings are designed to last decades rather than centuries, when historic properties are regularly demolished for new development, Biltmore endures. It endures because people have valued it enough to put in the enormous effort required to maintain it. It endures because it tells a story that resonates across generations. The story of Biltmore is ultimately a human story. It's about one man's dream and the thousands of people who worked to make that dream real. It's about a family that has stewarded this legacy through wars, depressions, and dramatic social changes. It's about the millions of visitors who have walked through its halls, each taking away their own impressions and memories. George Vanderbilt built a 250-room house because he could imagine it, because he believed it was worth doing, and because he had the means to make it happen. The fact that we can still visit it today, still marvel at its beauty, still learn from its example, suggests that he was right. Some things are worth building to last. Some visions are worth pursuing even when they seem impossibly ambitious. And some places, once created, take on a life and meaning far beyond their creator's original intentions.